We have been following the Malayan campaign since the start of the war, seeing the British Empire continually prove that it was hardly prepared to defend its eastern possessions. After many lost battles and desperate rearguard actions, last week the complete pullout from Johor was finally ordered, signifying the fall of Malaya as the British defenders retreated into Singapore to protect their so-called eastern fortress, called the Gibraltar of the East. The situation thus looked bleak for the empire in which the sun never sets, with the rising sun looking like it could menacingly replace their hegemony in the east. But before that, the British defenders were determined to offer as much resistance as they could in Burma and Singapore, so the stage was set for one of the most important battles of the Pacific War. We at Kings and Generals have a problem with many accounts across dozens of platforms. They have to be secure, so we use different passwords, which previously led to confusion and slowdowns. Thankfully, the sponsor of this video, NordPass, exists to help with this problem. NordPass is the essential cybersecurity tool that makes everyone's life easier and safer. A simple, easy-to-use and very secure password manager, created by the cybersecurity experts who built NordVPN. This advanced online security and privacy app is trusted by more than 14 million users worldwide. NordPass allows you to store all your passwords in one place and access them with a single master password. It makes logins faster with an autofill feature and generates complex passwords that make your account safer. You can use NordPass Sync across 6 different devices, which saves you time. NordPass's best feature is Password Health, which ascertains if your current passwords are old or weak, or used for several accounts. And we love that NordPass is a zero-knowledge password manager, which means that no one, even the NordPass team, can see what's in your encrypted vault. In short, NordPass is essential for any modern human. Support us and secure your passwords by downloading NordPass via the link in the description. Get 50% off a 2-year NordPass premium plan at nordpass.com/kingsandgenerals or use our code kingsandgenerals. You'll get an additional month for free. Since we've last seen, the American defensive lines in the Philippines had been completely pierced by the determined Japanese soldiers, forcing the defenders to retreat to some new positions on a rearguard line that stretched between the coastal towns of Arayan and Bagak. By January 26th, the Filipino forces under Generals Wainwright and Parker had completed their withdrawal, dividing their new defensive line into several sectors. In hot pursuit, the Japanese started to hammer the American defensive positions straight away, with General Nara and his 65th Independent Mixed Brigade advancing in the east, and with General Kimura's forces moving towards the west. But General Homma had an ace up his sleeve, a planned naval invasion to bypass the American defenses, and thus capture the naval base of Mariveles with the objective of cutting off the retreat of the defenders. 2 battalions from the 20th Regiment were thus appointed to land in small and isolated inlets, and then fight their way over sharp cliffs and points rising from the sea. Back on the evening of January 22nd, the landing craft set out from the town of Morong, heading towards Kaibobo Point, south of Bagak. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the landings went awry, facing rough seas, poor weather, and the threat of American PT boats. This caused them to misidentify the landing zone, coming ashore at Quinoran Point and Longaskawayan Point, which were further down the coast from where they expected to land, something that left them very isolated, but also very close to their target. Thus, the Battle of the Points had begun. On the morning of January 23rd, American naval lookouts saw some 300 Japanese soldiers moving inland from Longaskawayan Point. A combination of sailors, marines, and soldiers then rushed to dislodge the Japanese invaders, but thick jungle impeded their advance. They eventually managed to push back the Japanese, yet they could not defeat them. The Americans then exerted an intense artillery and mortar bombardment over the Japanese positions, but this could only contain their advance for so long, so General MacArthur decided to send his trained reserves to save the situation. Meanwhile, at Quinoran Point, 600 Japanese soldiers managed to consolidate their position in the face of staunch opposition by American airmen and Filipino constabulary forces. For several days, the situation would remain the same, with both the defenders and the invaders trying to reinforce their positions as much as they could. On the night of January 26th, Kimura committed his reserve battalion and sent it from Olongapo to reinforce the Japanese at Quinoran Point. But this battalion would also be subjected to bad weather, landing instead north of Quinoran Point at Anyasan Point. In response, Wainwright sent 2 battalions of Philippine scouts and some M3 tanks to reinforce the American defenders, while the remnants of the American Air Force carried out a successful raid over the fields at Nielsen and Nichols. While the Battle of the Points played out, Homma decided to appoint Lieutenant General Morioka Susumu to command the offensive against Wainwright's western area, reinforcing him with 2 battalions and some support units. Using night attacks all along the Orion-Bagak line, the Japanese would also manage to make some limited incursions during these days. But on January 28th, after 2 days of heavy fighting and a successful night assault, Nara would finally manage to breach the defensive line in 2 places at Sector C. Despite these successes, the Japanese would fail to exploit their gains, so their advance would become bogged down. The next day, reinforced by Philippine scouts and tanks, the American defenders would also manage to destroy the Japanese forces at Longaskawayan Point, thus removing the closest threat to Mariveles. Still, 2 more points were in Japanese hands, and they would continue to menace MacArthur's plans until they were removed. Now we turn to Borneo, where the Japanese forces were continuing to consolidate their gains on the island. Since the fall of Kuching, the remnants of the Punjabi battalion that were sent to defend British Borneo had retreated to the airfield of Singkawang II, joining a garrison of 750 Dutch soldiers. There, Colonel Lane placed his battalion under Dutch command for the defense of the airfield, while the Japanese forces of the Kawaguchi detachment prepared to execute a land-based attack from the north and a coastal assault from the west. On January 24th, this attack finally came to fruition, as 5 Japanese companies crossed the border and started their advance on Singkawang. The following day, they had reached a village northeast of the airfield, where Colonel Lane decided to launch a swift counterattack on January 26th. Yet this attack was repulsed, and by night, the Japanese had launched a strong assault that had turned the flanks of the defenders. With the battle lost, the Allies started the evacuation of Singkawang II airfield on January 27th, with a VCL light tank and a Brat Overwalgen covering their retreat at the crossroads between the towns of Ledo and Sengao, thus inflicting heavy casualties on the invaders. Although the Overwalgen managed to retreat to Ledo with only pierced tires, the tank had to be abandoned and was later captured by Japanese soldiers. Yet despite their valiant efforts, they could not prevent 2 Punjabi platoons from getting surrounded and annihilated. By the evening of January 27th, though, most of the defenders would reach Ledo and would establish new defensive positions there. Yet at the same time, the Japanese forces would land at Pemangkat, capturing several coastal towns to the south and getting close to Benkajang, thus threatening to surround the Allied forces at Ledo. This forced the defenders to retreat further east to Sangao and Sintang, then fighting a series of rearguard actions until January 31st, when the Allied forces would finally decide to pull back to the south coast of Borneo, where they would start to fight guerrilla warfare. And on the other side of the island, the Kume detachment had crossed the Duandang River by January 29th, getting very close to the oil fields of Sangasanga. Back on January 24th, some 300 Dutch soldiers under Captain Montero had started the demolition of such oil fields, leaving behind 80 men to delay the Japanese advance, while Montero retreated towards the town of Samarinda. These 80 men were then engaged by the Kume detachment, getting completely pummeled and retreating in disarray towards Lower Jinan. After the fall of Sangasanga, Montero decided to raise Samarinda and move his headquarters to Lower Jinan by January 31st, where he was planning to execute a long-term delaying action of the Japanese advance along the Mahakam River towards the Samarinda II airfield. But this week would also see the launch of a very important operation within the Dutch East Indies campaign, the invasion of Ambon. Ambon Island had always been the political, economic, and military center of the Moluccas, so it was natural that it held strategic importance for the Japanese. 2 battalions of the 38th Division, under Major General Ito Tekio, were appointed to carry out the Ambon operation, later reinforced with an additional battalion prior to the start of the invasion. The Eastern Detachment would be supported by an important fleet, primarily consisting of 2 cruisers and 14 destroyers, led by Rear Admiral Takagi Takeo. The Japanese planned to land on the east coast of the southern peninsula of Ambon, where the Allied defences were considered weak, so that the invaders could catch and destroy the main force of the defenders and promptly seize the strategic points of the island. Furthermore, Takagi also planned to land a regiment of SNLF Marines to capture the Laha airfield. Meanwhile, the Dutch countered with the Moluccan Brigade of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Capitz, totaling some 2,600 men, and on December 17th they had been further reinforced by the Gull Force, consisting of around 1,100 Australian soldiers under Lieutenant Colonel William Scott. They had started to suffer heavy bombardment by Japanese aircraft since January 24th, in preparation for the invasion to come. 3 days later, the Eastern Detachment departed Davao, heading towards Ambon, and on January 30th, the invasion convoy was discovered by a Brewster Buffalo bomber, although no air attacks were conducted. By nightfall, the convoy had entered the Hitulama anchorage, and on the early morning of January 31st, the Eastern Detachment began to land on the shores of Ambon. Following the landing, Ito ordered his men to push ahead and advance towards the city of Ambon across the steep mountains. Thus, a Japanese battalion quickly took the strong positions near Paso and Batugong and then advanced towards Ambon and Halong by February 1st, while the rest of the detachment, aided by air and artillery support, overran the Dutch forces on the coast and advanced directly on Ambon in 2 columns. With most of his defences designed to repel attacks from the north and west, Capitz could do nothing to help his desperately retreating forces. Furthermore, at noon on January 31st, the Allied communications were cut, so Capitz could not communicate with the 400 Australian defenders at Laha, which were being attacked by SNLF Marines. On the early morning of February 1st, the Japanese would finally consolidate at Paso, and Ito would manage to capture Ambon at last, forcing Capitz and some 800 Dutch soldiers to surrender at Halong. But the Australians kept fighting on, successfully repelling the Japanese invaders at Laha and on the Nona Plateau, yet will continue to cover their heroic defence next week. Now, we finally return to Malaya, where the British forces were starting to execute an orderly retreat towards Singapore, with the Australians withdrawing down the Trunk Road and with the 9th Indian Division moving down the railway. The retreating Indian forces from Muar were also withdrawing from Batu Pahat, with General Bennett sending the recently arrived 53rd Brigade to help them. On the early morning of January 25th, though, the Imperial Guards Division launched their attack over Batu Pahat, while some of their men also began to press a retreating Australian brigade at Ayahitam. Despite the strong barrage of the invaders, the defenders held firm and repelled each of the enemy attacks, inflicting heavy casualties on them and forcing the Japanese to retreat. Later that night, their valiant fighting had given time for the main Australian force to withdraw south towards Singpang Rengam. And at the same time, after a hard-fought struggle at the Nithsdale estate, elements of the 9th Division had pulled out of Kluang towards Sayonghalat and Rengam by January 26th, continuing their retreat south through the railway the following day. But on that same day, the RAAF launched a strong attack over Endau, which had been captured by the Japanese 18th Division back on January 21st, and was receiving reinforcements by sea. The British planes failed to cause severe damage to the 2 transport ships, and in turn they lost 15 planes. Later that night, 2 British destroyers under Commander William Moran launched a naval raid at Endau, but they were engaged by a small fleet under Rear Admiral Hashimoto Shintaro, losing one of the destroyers as a result. By January 28th, the Australian battalion that was covering the rearguard of West Force had gotten to the Namazi rubber estate south of Singpang Rengam. Yet this position was hardly ideal, as the extensive rubber plantations to the east of the Trunk Road offered the Japanese the chance to outflank the positions of the defenders, and this was exactly what the invaders would do. After launching an initial frontal assault against the Australian defensive lines during the morning, the Japanese would then attempt by midday an outflanking movement to cut the Trunk Road, and this was also what Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Blackjack Galligan was expecting. Launching a strong and decisive counterattack with armoured cars, the Australians inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese as their enemy retreated in disorder. Only the employment of toxic smoke bombs managed to save the situation for the defeated invaders, causing enormous anguish among the Australian soldiers that inhaled the gas. In the end, though, the battle was a huge success for the defenders, restarting their withdrawal southwards only a couple of hours later. The following day, they had gotten to the north of the town of Ayabemben, where they were again engaged by the fast and tenacious Japanese soldiers. In the meantime, Indian forces got to a roadblock close to Sengarang, while the 53rd Brigade advanced from Bennett to occupy Rengit in an attempt to help the Indians. Yet the 53rd would be defeated at Rengit and would have to retreat, forcing the Indians to get evacuated by sea towards Singapore. With only the depleted 53rd and the 28th Indian Brigade holding the west coast, Percival would have no other choice but to deploy the still resting 11th Indian Division, now under Major General Berthold Key, at Skudai on the Trunk Road. But to the east, by January 27th, the Indian Division of General Barstow had gotten south of Layang Layang, where they found out that the railway bridge had been accidentally demolished, thus separating the 22nd Brigade from the 8th Brigade up ahead and leaving them without communications. The following day, the misfortune of the 22nd Brigade increased, as they ran into a Japanese blockade over the railway that took them by surprise and managed to kill Barstow. This left Brigadier George Painter in charge, and he now faced a difficult decision whether or not to attempt an encircling movement around the enemy to continue his retreat. In the end, he chose this jungle exit, but after following a track through the jungle, the passage abruptly ended, leaving the Indian battalion with no other choice but to continue through the jungle without a compass. After 4 days of jungle trekking, they got north of Sedanag, but they were met by another Japanese force of the 5th Division that finally forced them to surrender. Meanwhile, the Australians under Galligan continued to offer ferocious resistance at Ayabamban against the Imperial Guards Division, then retreating after a couple of hours to the vicinity of Kulai. They held this position across January 30th without giving any more ground and inflicting many losses on the enemy. The precious time that they bought allowed the rest of the Australian forces to safely retreat towards Singapore, and by January 31st, the last British unit crossed the Causeway Bridge at Johor Bahru, finally abandoning the Malayan Peninsula. After blowing up the causeway behind them, the defenders began to establish positions across Singapore, concluding the fall of Malaya at long last. This has been all for this week, and this has been a very eventful week indeed. Next week, we'll continue talking about various operations across the Pacific Ocean, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.